You guys missed some really good stuff. But he wasn't looking to make Saul happy. He was looking to do what God wanted to do. And as a result, there were things going on underneath the fabric of what Saul might understand. And God is using Israel to destroy them. Later on in Israel's history, there is all kinds of immorality, all kinds of idolatry going on in Israel. And one of Israel's judges cries out to God and says, well, how long are you going to put up with this? And God says, don't worry about it. I've been watching, and I'm going to use the Babylonians to come in and to take them captive. Well, then all of a sudden the prophet says, but God, you can't use the Babylonians. They're pagans. They're idolaters. You couldn't use those guys to do this. So everybody always has an opinion of how God ought to do what God needs to do. But God gave Saul an assignment, and Saul didn't understand it, and Saul didn't keep it the way he should have. Number two, when God gives specific instructions, they need to be followed specifically. There wasn't a lot that Saul didn't do that God told him to do. Right? The only one we know of that was left alive was King Agag. And you just have to guess why Saul decided to keep Agag alive. Perhaps he was a trophy. Right? We see Saul going up to Mount Carmel and making a monument to himself for his great victory over the Amalekites. So maybe he's just so full of himself that he wants to drag Agag around with him while he's doing this. If Agag is in custody with Saul, then Agag had to climb up Mount Carmel with him and watch Saul set up his stela to celebrate his victory. Maybe Saul's just using Agag as a victory trophy to drag him around. We don't know. We do know that God said kill them all, and he brought Agag back. Then there's the matter of those sheep and those cattle. Saul goes in degrees, right? He first of all says, well, we did what God said. And Samuel says, well, then why do I hear sheep and cattle? He says, well, we kept a few of them because we wanted to make sacrifices. And Samuel keeps pushing the point until Saul says, oh, well, it was the men. It was their idea. And I was just afraid of the men, so I just went along with them because I didn't want my men to be angry with me. Now, this is actually the second time pretty close together that we see Saul giving in to his men. The first one was a good one. He was getting ready to put Jonathan to death. You remember that? Jonathan ate during the battle. He said, well, I'm going to have to put you to death. And the men rise up and say, there's no way. He's the hero of the day. You're not killing him. And so Saul gives in to the men. But this one is the opposite. He has directions from God on what he should do, and he decides not to do what God told him to do and listen to his men instead. So they come up with the animals that are supposedly going to be sacrificed. By the way, if you give a sacrifice to God at Gilgal, what do you get? You get part of the sacrifice as your meal. So they were planning a festival, perhaps. God was going to get some of the sacrifice, but the people were going to have a tremendous barbecue in the meantime. Let's make a little bit of an application if we can. Usually when you hear this chapter preached, and by the way, we're in the 15th chapter of 1 Samuel. We got started before I pushed the button. When you hear this chapter preached, one of the main topics will usually be the idea that we have something we think God will like. Right? There's a lot of religious groups in our day who can read Scripture as well as we can. And they see what God asks for. And then they say, well, wouldn't God like it better if? And particularly in the last 50 years or so, as congregations have been in decline. And so I don't know how large this congregation might have been, but I'll use another as a representation. I was with a congregation that was a little over 100 the first day I preached there. I left there. They were at about 84. I came back and preached for them a few years later. They were in the 60s, and then later on they were in the 20s and 30s, right? So you see that decline. And a lot of congregations and a lot of religious organizations have said, what can we do to put people in the pews? And at some point they get to the place where they say, well, we know God said this, but maybe wouldn't God allow us to do this if it helps people come to know Jesus? So we'll use something that God told us not to do to try to accomplish something that we think God wants us to do. That's the reasoning in a lot of religious groups in our day. What would God's answer be? Saul, what did I tell you to do? I gave you a job. I told you specifically how to do the job that I gave you. Right? We have great instructions in the New Testament on how to bring people to Christ. We have great instructions on how to worship Him once they're there. Do we just throw all of that out the window and say, well, wouldn't God think it was okay if we did this? And perhaps God would say to us, as He said to Saul, I told you how to do it. I told you what I wanted. If I'd have wanted the other thing, I knew how to ask for that. If I wanted you to bring back sheep and cattle to make sacrifices to me, I could have easily asked for that. In fact, there are other battles that God sends Israel into where He says, I want you to keep some of the best for yourself, and these particular things I want you to take to the tabernacle, to the temple, because they're mine. That's not what He says about Amalek and about Agag. He says, kill them, wipe out their flocks and their herds, don't bring anything back. This is very, very similar to what went on at Jericho when they first came across the Jordan River. So God knows how to ask for what He wants, and we should follow specifically His specific information. Number 3, did you find Saul's attempts at self-justification a little bit pitiful? Right? I have been in conversations with second graders that were real close to this. You start out with a statement of, I'm right. I've got it. I did everything I was supposed to do. Stamp my paper with a big smiley face and let me go on my way. And you say, but you didn't put your name on the paper. Oh, they write their name on the paper. Well, I assigned every problem on the page and you did 1, 4, 7, and 10. What about those other ones? Oh, I forgot about those. I was busy. And then eventually it'll be somebody else's fault, right? I was doing my work and Sally started talking to me, and I couldn't do my work because Sally was talking to me. Right? Eventually it's going to be somebody else's fault. So we've got, I did everything God told me to do. Then we've got, we did what God said about the people. We just brought back Agag. Then you've got, we did what God said about the livestock, except the animals we saved for sacrifices. And then finally we get to, I, Saul, was so afraid of my enlisted men that I let them do what they wanted to do, and we're going to say that that was because they were going to make sacrifices. So you could just see, it just dwindles down, until finally Samuel says, you're not going to be king anymore. Now this isn't the first time Samuel has told him that. He told him before, if you had been obedient to God, then God would have established you as a dynasty. But as it is, you're not going to be a dynasty. No son of yours will sit on the throne, and you don't get to keep the throne of Israel. Here he says, God has taken away from you the throne of Israel, and He's giving it to somebody better. That's exactly what you want to hear, isn't it? Saul just set up a monument to himself up on Mount Carmel. He is so happy with the job he's doing as king. The people around him are lauding and applauding him. And then Samuel shows up. He says, not only are you not going to be king anymore, God's got somebody that'll be better than you to be king. So this is the first prophecy we hear that we can kind of interpret who's coming. We know the answer, right? Samuel does not yet know who this guy is. Saul does not yet know who this guy is. We know who this guy is. Who's this guy? That's David. David is on his way. He's still a little kid. But we know, God knew, that David was going to sit on the throne. What's so special about David? Not just that he was better than Saul. David starts a dynasty. Saul couldn't start a dynasty because Saul wouldn't be obedient. David, a man after God's own heart, starts a dynasty. And from that dynasty comes Messiah, and from Messiah comes our salvation. So all the way back here with Saul not doing what God told him to do is another hint at where God is headed with our salvation. I think we mentioned it this morning. We'll mention it again. Go all the way back to Adam and Eve. And when sin came into the world, God started bringing forth Messiah. And he brought him through Abraham, and he brought him through Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and all the way down until he brought David to the throne, and then through David's lineage, he brought our Messiah. So God is moving everything toward our salvation all through the Old Testament. So now we have the first prophecy. But I want to notice just at the very end of this chapter is really sad. We've talked about how Samuel and Saul were kind of on the outs. Saul was using the priesthood of Eli. Eli's grandson was his priest in these encampments. So it wasn't like they had called for Samuel to come and make sacrifices at Gilgal and, hey, don't worry about it, we'll bring the sheep. They had a priest in the encampment who should have known better, but wasn't doing better. He was leading the people spiritually in the wrong direction, but they're coming to Gilgal, and it's Eli's grandson who is the priest over this bunch. He's the one who would have made those sacrifices. So Samuel and Saul are on the outs, but notice those last couple of verses. Until the day that Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, but Samuel mourned for him. And the Lord regretted that he ever made Saul king over Israel. It's a sad ending to that chapter. Why is Samuel mourning for Saul? Well, Samuel was the leader of Israel. Samuel was a priest and a prophet. He was everything but the king. And the people of Israel said, we want a king. And God says, okay, we'll give them a king. And he brings in Saul. So Saul is the replacement for Samuel. Who did a better job following God? Samuel, right? I could have just stayed in the job if that's what we're going to do. If we're going to bring in this guy who's head and shoulders taller than everybody else, but won't do what God tells him to do. So Samuel doesn't have the kind of fulfillment, the kind of completion to the task that I'm sure he would have loved to see in the ministry of Saul, in the kingdom of Saul. So he does. He mourns for him. And the end of the verse says basically the Lord was mourning for Saul as well. He regretted that he ever put him in the job in the first place. When you see that phrase, and it happens more than once in the Old Testament, God regretted doing something. Doesn't that just tear your heart out? Here's a God who knows. He knows what it would be like for Saul to be king. He knows what it would be like and his leadership style and who he's going to be. He knows all those things when he puts him in. But he tells him the right things to do. And Saul doesn't do them. And it pains God. One of the other places is found in Genesis 6. What does it pain God in Genesis 6 that he did? Anybody? That he ever created man in the first place. Yet God regretted it that he ever created man in the first place. But the next verse says, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So when we go from chapter 15 to chapter 16, we move from mourning for Saul to celebrating the future. Something good is on its way. So we'll leave it right there. Lord willing, pick that up next week. Any questions? Okay. See y'all later.